A long time ago, on a comics page far, far away.
Welcome to Panel Up, your monthly pop culture panel. I'm John Campbell.
And I am Mike Gergoni.
Gergoni, back again for the beautiful spring month as I look outside at the gray skies around me.
John, if you don't like the weather in Oregon, wait 5 minutes.
There you go. That's it exactly. Yes, this is our March episode, but no gray skies where we're headed, Gergoni. We're headed to a very deserty planet.
Look, the skies of Arrakis are filled with eyes and the blinding Arrakeen sun. That is all we know.
This is true. Yes, we're back to Arrakis. Is that the title of this? Dune 2, Back to Arrakis. No, yeah, it's Dune Part 2, the much anticipated sequel.
Yes. Now that we are 2/3 of the way through Denis Villeneuve's Dune trilogy, because right off the bat, like, this does not feel like a two-parter. This feels like part 2 of 3.
Absolutely. I mean, and I didn't know how much it was going to feel like that before I went in, but I mean, certainly he's already talked about how he had in the press for this movie. I had heard him already talking about he's been tinkering with the script for. I don't know if it's going to be called Dune Part 3. I would just call it Dune Part 3. Yeah. But what will be basically his adaptation of Dune Messiah.
Well, we'll get into some bigger questions about that. About, like, is it going to be an adaptation of Dune Messiah, or
that's what
he is? Yeah,
he's been talking about adapting Dune Messiah, but as we both know, that a movie does not inherently make.
Yeah, and like where this Dune Part 2 leaves some inherently, like, staggering questions that if you just skip to the events of Dune Messiah, is just like, oh, and a bunch of stuff happened that we're not going to see.
Well, he talked about, and this is, I love this where we're starting, but like something I've heard him talk about a lot is he has obviously the foresight that Frank Herbert didn't, who was writing these one-to-one. He has a vague idea, of course, where this is going. So he talked about some of the changes he makes in this movie were to seed more of a part 3.
Absolutely.
Then Herbert wrote a novel, and then kind of, as I'm sure you're aware, was kind of dismayed by the reaction to his first novel. So Dune Messiah is sort of a reaction to the reaction to Dune.
Yeah, it's a lot shorter. It's a lot pithier. It is a little bit more, like, politically oriented and less, like, opaque in terms of its themes.
Yeah, because Herbert was very dismayed by people sort of not realizing the cautionary tale that Dune was. So he was like, I need to be more overt about this in the sequel, which, also makes Dune Messiah kind of a huge bummer.
That book is a straight up bummer.
Yeah. So, it's
I would argue that the entire Dune franchise is kind of a bummer, at least while Frank is writing it.
Yeah, but there are much more. That stuff is much more at the forefront of this movie than it is. He's not adding anything that isn't there. He's just highlighting stuff that I think Herbert probably. I mean, he's talked about. He goes, obviously you can't ask Frank Herbert, but he goes, I think I'm doing things that he would have approved of, because in some ways I'm changing the events of Dune to actually make things clearer that he talked about later wanting people to get from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the additions and subtractions that exist in this movie, and we'll get into those in more detail, because on the precursor to this movie, I just reread the novel for the umpteenth time, so it was fresh in my head.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've said this on this particular iteration of the show, but I've definitely said it before. I read Dune every year. It is probably my favorite book. I try to get something new out of it every time in terms of, like, what themes I'm paying attention to, which characters I'm, like, highlighting. Not literally highlighting. I would never desecrate my sacred Dune in that manner.
Sure, of course, yeah. How many copies do you own at this point? You used to have quite a few.
It's approaching double digits.
Okay, yeah. I've been to enough, like, used bookstores with you and stuff that if you find a printing of Dune you don't have, you will grab it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Were you with me in Corvallis when I found my first edition of that?
I think so. Yeah.
We just wandered into that like random used
Yeah.
bookstore.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, so needless to say, I fucking love Dune. So seeing it adapted in this way, because the specter of the 80s movie has always kind of haunted me.
Fucking love that movie though.
And look,
I love that movie.
It has its moments.
Yeah.
I will never get the image of Patrick Stewart pugs akimbo leading a battle charge.
Dude, Patrick Stewart rules in that movie. That movie is so weird. I mean, like I said, regardless of it as an adaptation, and we did a whole episode about that, which you can go into our archives if you're one of our patrons and listen to us talk about. But that movie is just so weird. I just love the ride that Lynch took a movie studio's money on with that movie. And also, I do think it was an attempt to do, I mean, the mandate was also, he was doomed, right? Because the mandate was do this whole book in one movie.
Right, which was never
No.
possible.
So I think that's why I mean, like, I love that movie while also recognizing the limitations of it. And I would never be like, boy, that's the definitive take. But I still love that movie. And it's crazy. I mean, it is such a bombastic, insane movie. Whereas I think the thing that really, and I was talking to a friend of the show, Brendan Jones, because we saw Dune Part 2 together. The thing that's so amazing to me about both of Villeneuve's movies, and particularly two of them together, is he has made this book that, for me and for a lot of people, I mean, obviously not, it means a lot to you, but for a lot of people, is kind of hard to engage with the actual book itself. But he's turned it into something without dumbing it down that is very approachable as a narrative.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most successful adaptations since Jackson's Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of people compare it to that, and I think that absolutely they have a lot of the same strengths.
Because, like you said, not dumbing down, I think, is a big one, and respecting the themes and tones of the author's intent while still modernizing it in ways that make it approachable. Because in like reading Lord of the Rings, you're left with a lot of like breakaways for songs and poetry and things that like build the theme of the Middle Earth that Tolkien is trying to present. But capturing the soul of that is something Jackson excelled at, and in this, approaching the grim, stark reality of the Dune universe, of this like feudal future that Frank Herbert wrote, is something that I think Villeneuve does a really good job of encapsulating, and especially in Dune 2 gives us an idea of the larger scope of what's happening here. One of the not complaints, but one of the things that can make Dune a little bit less approachable is that it's so hyper-focused on the main characters, specifically like Jessica and Paul, that you kind of lose sight of what's happening outside of them. On one of my many, many rereads, one of the focuses I tried to give is just like, okay, give me outside world details and like what universe is trying to be built here. And really where that comes in is in the beginning of every chapter, you have an aside from Princess Irulan, who is played by Florence Pugh in Dune Part 2.
Yes.
And in the book, she is writing from the future about the events that are happening over the course of both this book and the war that Dune Part 2 leads up to.
Which is something that Lynch really tries to embrace in his movie as because it is kind of the only thing you can do, right? Or it's one of the things you can pull from the book to try to like corral this whole thing. But that movie, they go over the top with it because they're trying to condense the whole thing into 2 hours.
And this tries to turn it into a framed narrative, which it really isn't.
But I don't know how else you would approach it in that structure. Whereas here they keep some of that, but they're using it in a different way, and it almost feels more like all the Princess Irulan stuff. And this almost feels a little Star Trek-y and like Captain's Log sort of thing, where it's almost like it's her almost giving like the official royal log of here's the situation, right? And here is she is doing it, but in the moment, right, for future generations.
Well, and
She's
I've
writing
been
history.
reading like debate as to like who those dictations are for. Are they for herself for future writings? Are they for the Bene Gesserit? Are they for some imperial document? In the movie, it's unclear.
Yeah, it looks cool as hell. I love
Yeah.
all the weird scrolls that type out that seem literally the scene where Walken gets the thing and looks at it. I'm like, I don't even. That seems impossible to understand how to read that.
It looks like the writing is Greek, but it was tough to tell.
Could be, could be, or at least something based off of that as a starting point.
Well, and like the whole House Atreides being from the line of Agamemnon all the way back to ancient Earth is
Right.
like kind of the idea in universe is that like a lot of these peoples are descended from ancient houses that they claim trace back to Earth.
Ah, yes, yes. But like we're talking about, the thing that's so great about the movie is and I think why it's so successful, obviously, with people is all of that is the framework, right? It's all that's all on the fringe of stuff. And the movies really allow you kind of like very much in the same way as Jackson, where it's like, or even some of the stuff that when we talk about Star Wars on a regular basis does this, is that stuff you can dive into as much as you want to, but the characters at the center of this and the main narrative is very clear. Like he really, Villeneuve's scripts in particular for these movies, I'm always shocked at how grounded they feel, how otherworldly the world is, but how not otherworldly the characters are. The characters feel very understand. I can really, when the particularly like the Paul and Chani stuff, I can really be like, man, this feels so real,
Well,
while in this heightened other world.
I think that is the mark of good A, handle on the material, and B, just the director keeping the focus where it needs to be, which is the character, right? Because so often you see these genre pictures that can really go bug nuts on their world building, but that just leaves the actors kind of standing in the blue screen somewhere looking slightly confused, and it can remove them from the world that they're in.
Well, I mean, think right off the bat, just his approach of using minimal green screen, right, and shooting in the desert, automatically just seeing real people in real locations, immediately starts you in your mind going like, okay, I'm in on this. Like I buy it. I'm looking at real people really experiencing the heat and the sand and that takes. And then you have a director who's directing actors that feel very naturalistic, and in his adaptation of the material, feeling very. It still feels futuristic. It still feels sci-fi, but it feels very, like I said, very real. Like like, oh, this dial. It doesn't have some of that space opera kind of like, except when it needs to. When you're talking about the Emperor and that kind of stuff, or even the Harkonnens have more grandiosity to them. But when you're out with the Fremen, there's a casualness that doesn't feel like, well, I've entered another world, or where everyone sort of has this highfalutin kind of dialogue that can sometimes irk me in larger science fiction stuff, which to me always strikes of people wanting something to feel science fiction-y as opposed to just, letting the world live.
Well, and that's I think one of the things I latched onto in Dune Part 2 is the additions that Villeneuve made. And obviously, like, he can't take sole credit, though he is a big contributing factor to the vision of this. We have so many people contributing to this movie. John Spates is the other credited screenplay writer, but I also want to highlight one of the senior art directing by Andrew Ackland Snow, because like the visual motif of this film is just so striking, because one of the big things this movie does is show us what the Emperor's Court looks like and what the Harkonnen homeworld looks like. And like in the book, we really don't get much in the way of descriptions of that. One of the like faults, if you want to call it that, of Frank Herbert as a writer is you can sometimes feel like the characters are just floating in a space where they're interacting with each other in some kind of black box theater. That's why you can do something like the sci-fi miniseries and not have it feel like totally disproportional to the source material. Like, obviously, it has some qualities that are both good and bad.
That I find much harder to go back to than the Lynch movie, because the Lynch movie is so out in its own world, whereas the sci-fi miniseries does feel like it was an attempt to do definitive, but just couldn't. I mean, it was doomed by being a sci-fi miniseries. But I remember at the time thinking, "Oh, that's pretty good," you know.
And I've rewatched that quite a bit because I always saw that as more of a faithful adaptation.
Sure.
But I think these movies have like firmly supplanted
That's
that.
what I'm saying. Is I think these movies have much more stomped out on those, whereas Lynch is just out in fucking Lynch land, you know?
Yeah, like that's always going to be its own weird thing where fucking Paul makes it rain at the end of the movie for no reason.
It rules. I don't know. That movie rules. I don't know. I just love that movie. But yeah, I know. But almost as its own thing, as just like Lynch does sci-fi.
Yeah, no. In the same way that like Jodorowsky's like proposed Dune film would have been just an absolute bug nuts wonderland.
I mean, it is kind of cool to imagine a world where people just came along every couple years and just put their stamp on Dune. Like, here's this crazy director's stamp on Dune. Because I do think, and I've seen the people who are such hardcore fans of the book be like, "No, it's still just Villeneuve's Dune, though." And you're like, "Sure, it is," but it does seem like, and once again, and I am nowhere near the Dune scholar that you have. I've talked about, I find the book very impenetrable. A lot of other material has helped me with the books. I like the audiobook versions. I like the graphic novel adaptations, because I do think the book is dense. It is purposely very dense. And I struggle with that, but I have come to become a bit. So when I say that, though, I'm going like, I don't know, man, this seems pretty fucking definitive. Like, I mean, I don't see anybody getting more definitive than this. Let me say that.
Because here's the thing. It's a different medium. So it's always like,
that's what I mean.
Definitive Dune is Dune, the book.
That's it, exactly. And that's where I think, the comparison to the Jackson Lord of the Rings movies are that as well, where it's like, these are truly great adaptations by the definition of what an adapted screenplay should be.
Right.
These are doing as good a job of making the movie version of this thing. Because, yeah, there are just things you just can't do in them. I mean, and you see that actually in the Lynch movie, his attempts to do all the internal dialogue. He does that, which is being very true to the book, except that's a weird thing in a movie to suddenly have like tons of internal thought.
Yeah, to have like internal monologue from multiple characters in a film is really bizarre.
It's super bizarre, and that made that movie was impenetrable when that came out. People did not know what to make of that thing, but still, yeah.
I think what we're getting at when it comes to like definitive adaptation, whatever that means, is if you want to experience this story but don't have the time to devote to sitting down and reading a novel or listening to an audiobook, if you just want to spend an afternoon getting the vibe of the story again, these movies are like probably as good as we're going to get anytime soon.
Well, and the thing, of course, that also, and the same thing with the Jackson movies too, right? At least I mean the Lord of the Rings. I don't mean.
Yeah. We leave the Hobbit out of this discussion.
But the thing is, they are great adaptations. They are also great movies, though. Like, that's the other thing too, is they are really engaging pieces of filmmaking entertainment. Like, that's the thing I think that is often. I think that's also where the sci-fi miniseries suffers, and some of that is because of the scale. But it is like that's not a very mainstream appealing thing.
Yeah.
Like, Villeneuve has found a way to sell this to a big audience. Once again, as we talk about, without dumbing it down, without it feeling like, oh God, here's the audience-friendly version. But he's made. The word I come up with is approachable. That's what Brendan and I kept saying. It's incredible how approachable these movies are.
It's interesting you say that, because I've been reading a lot of stuff online about these films, and there is an opinion out there that without having foreknowledge of the story, where your brain can fill in certain details or like know how the bits connect. That the part of this conversation you and I aren't having is people who are getting exposed to Dune as a property for the first time, because that is a movie doesn't do this well without that happening, at least where like genre fiction is concerned.
That was exactly the point I was going to make. I think while we can't say that because we are people who are, you in particular, are so steeped in it, and me, who certainly is very familiar with the story itself, but clearly it is working for people because they're going back, and they came to, and this is also an example of part one was very successful, and part two seems to be doing even more, which implies even more people found part one in the interim, and I think watching on Max. Yeah. The rentals and stuff, all that.
I think it's on Netflix right now.
Yeah.
And
it's
the question I have about that, and is something that you and I were talking about just briefly before we started recording, which is how much of that is this insistence by media, pop culture media at large, that this is the conversation piece of the moment, and so to not experience it is to miss out on that conversation.
Well, because I think we were talking about the box office success of this as being brought up as this is some of the best. You know, the last time we saw this was last summer with Barbenheimer, which I think that and this both, and I think part one had this a little bit, and part two even more so, has this thing about like, you've got to see it. You've got to go see this. You don't go to a lot of movies, but you got to go to this. There is that feeling of that, but something has to do that because other movies can't do that. Like there is something intrinsic. There's got to be right in the center of this thing that is pulling people because
and any to have people express.
Yeah.
No. You can't have like the Paw Patrol movie saying like you gotta experience this in theaters,
right? It's sort of like the buzz can only get you so far. Like you have to have the goods.
The second week that Dune Part 2 is out, we now see the opening of Kung Fu Panda 4.
Another masterpiece cinematic saga.
I love the first three Kung Fu Panda movies. I really do.
Not in my defense, but for sake, I've only seen the first one. I've never watched the other one.
And my point is like no other movie in theaters at the moment is leaning on this like gotta see it mentality, unless you're talking Madam Web, in which case you're talking about you gotta see how big of a train wreck this is.
Yeah. Another friend of the show, Robin Jones, manages a movie theater, and he talks about on the discount days they've been getting a lot of people from Madam Web who are going like, "Hey, it's cheap now, and we heard it's terrible."
I didn't bring this up during our review last month, but when I saw it in Screen X, I wasn't charged any extra for that.
Oh, wow. That's not good. Dude, we don't even care. Just we got to get somebody in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Whereas I'm sure, but and that's another big thing in this film's box office favor is the other big thing that they're doing is you've got to see this in IMAX. You've got to see it on a large screen.
I'm assuming you saw it in IMAX, John.
Yeah.
So did I. So I can't speak to the comparison point, but I knew, having seen the first Dune in both formats, that the IMAX experience was just on a whole other level in terms of the sound design and being like engulfed in the picture. And the fact that the movie was shot for that format.
I'm an IMAX nerd to begin with because I do feel like IMAX is just a larger screen, better sound. Like it really is that thing. So, and to me, when I go see a movie, I want to see a movie writ large, especially something like this that really is. The other thing I think about these movies is they are so hearkening back to when we actually had true epics of cinema. Like I'm talking like the 50s. Like you can compare this to Lord of the Rings, but honestly, I go back further. I compare this to like a David Lean movie, like Lawrence of Arabia.
Like that, there's some obvious comparisons there.
Yeah, I mean but not just Lawrence of Arabia. Ben-Hur, Bridge on the River Kwai, movies that were you have to see this spectacle. And we're so used to spectacle in movies being like, well, sure, yeah, we've seen everything under the sun now. They've talked about, it's something I've seen think pieces written about, like, are we now in a generation where you just can't wow an audience anymore with spectacle? And I think these movies have managed to achieve that in a way. And I actually think last year Oppenheimer was that in a way, which is interesting because Oppenheimer is such an internal character study, but did have that old-fashioned sweep of a historical epic. And I think these movies have that same vibe too. Once again, that I reserve for these massive movies, and particularly like the 50s and 60s, which was kind of a similar time to now when TV had become so ubiquitous that movies were trying to find a way to go, well, how do we really make the movie going experience like a selling point? And so I would love to see a return to that, where it's like we're making movies on a massive scale of spectacle because we're trying to draw people back in. Also make them good was a good idea too. But
well, and that's, I've seen a lot of think pieces right now about like what Marvel can learn from Dune Part 2.
Yeah, and I think that was the thing that I was about to say before and then we said we got to save this for the show. Is like, I think both with Barbenheimer and this, I think lessons to learn to replicate these are very hard.
Yeah, because other than get good, scrub.
Yeah, but also that seems to also not matter a lot of times. Tons of good movies come out and before it's like, I don't know, man. I honestly think we're looking at a world where like, we're just gonna get some of these. Like, I don't know that this is like any, because I keep seeing also think pieces about like Barbenheimer here to start up the blockbuster box office again. Dune Part 2, get ready for the new flood of blockbusters. Like, I don't know, man. I think these are kind of rarities. I really don't think this is the beginning of a new thing. I think it really is. There's gonna be a few of these, maybe a year. But I don't think people keep waiting for these movies that will signal the return to the theater for people. And I think it really is. I think people are just going like, well, if I feel I have to go, I'll go.
And it's this idea that like a movie demands to be seen on a big screen is what draws people into a theater. So your run-of-the-mill Marvel movie, no offense to like the Marvels or Quantumania or some of the recent movies that people have shit on, but you and I both enjoy.
Yeah. But they are ubiquitous. People are used to them, right?
Yeah. And like, I don't feel the overwhelming need to see it writ large in the same way that I did like Wakanda Forever.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a big thing too that we've talked about a lot too. If you're going to have a franchise that's going to have a bunch of movies, you've got to temper your expectations per movie. You've got to realize that was the thing about Quantumania and people talking about it bombing. It's like, I don't know, man, all the Ant-Man movies make less than like a fucking Spider-Man movie. And if you're trying to make that level, and Star Wars needs to learn that lesson. My God, does Star Wars need to learn that lesson? Jesus Christ, you guys.
I mean, I think it has learned that lesson in that they haven't made a movie in a while.
Yeah, them immediately trying to make their next movie, though, a sequel to Rise of Skywalker feels like maybe they haven't learned their lesson. But
we'll see.
We'll see.
I want to see them give Daisy Ridley another fair shake, but that's just
me. There's also a part of me, though, that I like her, that I want her to just run away from that franchise. Go do some interesting stuff and just get out of there. But no, but I do think that is a thing where it's like, and Dune is familiar enough, but it's not, I think I love that Denny is saying, and we're on a first name basis. But the he is saying, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to make a trilogy and be out, because that Warner Brothers is seeing these numbers going, how many books are there? Oh baby. And you're like,
and Brian Herbert's thinking the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, I saw that executive producer credit.
So here's the thing with to explain to our listeners a little bit, who Brian Herbert is. Brian Herbert is Frank Herbert's son.
Brian, son of Frank.
Brian, son of Frank. He is an author in his own right. Yes, I meant the pun. And in his, I don't want to say infancy of his career, because he was writing books even with his father. But like after Frank Herbert died, there were always these like rumors circulating, nerds circles about like, oh, the series isn't done because Chapter House Dune kind of ends on a cliffhanger. That's the last book that Frank Herbert wrote.
Now, what number was that?
That was 6.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought it was. Yeah, Frank did 6. That was my memory.
Yeah, it's Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, Chapter House Dune.
Yeah.
I've only read. I would say you could read 1 through 3, read a synopsis of 4, then read 5 and 6.
Okay, there's some growing pains.
Look, God Emperor is a weird fucking book.
I have heard this, yes.
Not to say that Heretics and Chapter House aren't weird fucking books. I could go on all day about like the weird.
Yeah. But how many are they up to now? I mean, hasn't Brian's written more than Frank at this point?
This is what I'm going to get at: is to quote unquote finish that series. Brian Herbert claimed, and the validity of this has always been questioned.
Yeah.
Claimed he found a stack of his dad's notes or had access to them that outlined where the story was going to go. And in order to tell the wrap-up story, he needed to write 2 prequel trilogies to Dune, one of which was set at the earliest days of the Empire after humanity had to fight a war against evil robots.
When's that movie coming out?
Look, I'm sure Brian's hoping for it.
I'm sure Warner Brothers is got somebody thinking about it.
And so after he wrote those 2 prequel trilogies, so that's 6 books right there. He then wrote a 2-part finale to the sequel to Chapter House. So he just to finish Frank's work, he wrote 8 books, which is 2 more than Frank ever wrote.
That seems insane to me. I'm not saying he's a liar, but I'm just saying that seems a little nuts.
Oh, and if I took the time to explain the plot of how this story wraps up, you would agree that seems absurd. There are clones of clones. There are evil Pauls fighting good Pauls. It's a whole thing.
Something tells me we're probably not going to see that on screen anytime soon.
But since he wrapped up the series...
there are more books, right?
He has written more books. Some of them are prequels to the original Dune. Some of them, fill in gaps of time between Frank Herbert books. I don't know. I know he's in the double digits at this point, but I don't know exactly how many, because I checked out after the finale, quote-unquote.
And that is something to say of you checking out, because you're, as big a Dune supporters out there, so if you're not keeping up with these...
But here's the thing. It's because Brian Herbert, his style is just, he's a different writer, and that's fine. You don't have to be a copy of your father as an author. He's also written all of these books with the help of author Kevin J. Anderson, most famous probably for a bunch of Star Wars stuff.
Yeah. I've read a number of his things, especially in middle school when I was reading all the Star Wars shit.
And so that's the tone that all of his Dune books basically have.
Yeah.
They're less... I don't want to say less cerebral, because that seems insulting, but they are less contemplative. They are less focused on character interiority, and they're a lot more focused on bombastic sci-fi ideas, which is fun and cool, and I love sci-fi that does that, but juxtaposing it next to Dune always feels odd.
Yeah, it's a similar, and this can happen a lot. I've talked about, and this is certainly a much less sprawling saga, but Lee Child recently retired from writing the Jack Reacher novels, and I have fallen off of that series because I don't like his brother's books as much in the same way. It's just done. You can tell it's a different writer.
Yeah,
and you just go it's just not the flavor of what I like.
So all of that is to say, if they wanted to continue this franchise in film format or TV format, wherever they want to do.
They want to do both, of course.
Yeah, of course they do. There's plenty of material out there of varying qualities.
I have read some of and I don't know if these are based on anything. I've read some of the prequel comic books they put out. I read
House Atreides, House Harkonnen, and House Carino are the second prequel trilogy that Brian wrote.
And I've thought those comic books have been pretty good, but they don't feel consequential. Let's say that they're kind of fun. I mean, I like the House Atreides book because it focuses a lot on Duncan Idaho, who of course is my favorite character.
Yeah, and all of his Swordmaster of Ganaz stuff. It's super.
That shit's cool as hell. Yeah. But none of it feels like, boy, this is so wildly necessary. It all just feels like they feel like what should be comic books, actually, where they are sort of just like, well, this just feels like fun ancillary little side stories. So the idea of treating, honestly, I'm having trouble. I was trying to get a number on how many books it is. The the Dune Wikipedia page is insane. I'll just say the amount of time where, because you're talking about breaks into this trilogy and that trilogy and this side thing over here and this over there. But literally, yeah, there's what Princess of Dune was the last book that came out in 2023.
Yes. And that is one that focuses on Paul's sister, I want to say.
I think you might be right about that.
I'm
But I will say, just looking at it, they have the by Frank Herbert section, and then the by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. O'Connor, it explodes.
Yeah,
I mean they've probably tripled the amount of books that Frank wrote.
Yeah, and among people who enjoy Dune, and I'm specifically talking about the Dune subreddit that I frequent.
Sure,
there is a lot of offhanded talk.
It's 26 novels in total now.
Holy shit!
So they've written 20 past where Frank. Jesus.
There is a callous discussion that happens of people who claim that Brian is simply wringing blood from stone at this point in order to cash in on the namesake of Dune. Take that with a grain of salt, because again, I haven't read, now at this point, the majority of the books he's written.
Well, I'm just scrolling through, and I will say it does speak to, I don't hear, not just you, but I just don't hear these discussed in the pop culture space. I don't hear many people go, "Did you read the new Dune?" Like even not reading all these sci-fi, I at least hear people talk about the big sci-fi titles, even if I don't read them. So the fact that
I look and see the Nebula Awards every year.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like I don't hear these discussed, which is kind of, whether you want to talk about oh, it's just, by the way, it's 24 novels because they're counting the 2 graphic novels as books.
Oh.
So sorry, it's 24 they've done.
Okay.
But still, that's still insane. Oh, no, wait. No, Princess of Dune is split between Erlon and Chani's perspectives. 2 years before the events of Dune, Princess of Dune delves into the lives of 2 of the most important women in Paul Atreides' life.
Fascinating.
So it is the events right before Dune from the perspectives of Chani and Princess Erlon.
To swing this back to the movie.
Yeah, sorry, back to the movie. Well, I think in the broader, this is kind of what I was saying, was talk about wrangling all this. Because this is certainly what has kept me away from a lot of this stuff. It's just oh, Jesus, I don't even know, man.
What I would say is I'm curious to read a synopsis of Princesses of Dune to see whether or not any of the added Chani stuff that we got in this movie, which I think is some of the most interesting stuff that is added, is a influence of Brian or something invented for this film that informs her as a character.
Yeah, because I think Chani is one of the, truly one of the biggest, if not changes, evolutions from the book, right? Because it's not.
This movie changes its 2 central women characters in some big ways. I want to talk about Chani. I want to talk about Jessica. I think those 2 are the biggest changes from the book in terms of how their character functions within the story.
Yeah. And I think and a lot of that is, once again, what I've heard specifically Villeneuve talk about, the changes he made in his script to specifically lay seeds for where the third part is going. Particularly, he's talked about with Chani. He basically, from what I gather, completely rethought her place in the story.
And that makes sense given the events of Messiah and how you want to adapt Messiah. Mm-hmm. Because, spoiler alert, no happy endings for anyone.
Right. Well, yeah, and I'll get into that. Yeah. Anyway, yes, that's true.
I think, at best, Jessica gets to go retire in the book. Her and Stilgar get to go live on Caladan for the rest of their days.
Yeah.
But even then, it is fraught because it is the mother of the Emperor we're talking about here.
Well, to me, this is because well, I guess in broader strokes about that, yeah, Dune is a tragedy, right? It is,
Yeah.
and in the thing I like about Dune is that it is basically like a big Shakespearean tragedy in space. Like it really does sort of feel that like palace intrigue, um, people with the best of intentions being, if not corrupted, certainly consumed by power.
Well, it's Macbeth if Macbeth believes the prophecy, right?
Right.
It's like the guy knows that all of his actions will end in blood, and it's still the only way forward.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing I like about this. And I saw this, and I always kind of bag on them. So, but I was reading an AV Club article about this that was talking about the changes to Chani and talking about like at the end of the story, she realizes that the man she loves is just as power hungry as the rest of them, as anyone who's ever lived or whatever. And and that kind of I went like, I'm not sure that's my read. And then I was so glad that so many people in the comments were going like, I wouldn't describe Paul Atreides is power hungry, and I think people are getting at what I read it as is yes, at a certain point, this guy realizes the track he's on will lead to this, but there is no other track to get onto. Basically, it is it is not about being, at least to me, I look at it as it's not about being power hungry, but just realizing like either we're going to be under the foot of this guy, or I'm going to be in charge and have my foot on the neck of somebody. But there is no real way to not have this be some sort of totalitarian existence. And so it's almost a systemic tragedy.
Yeah, no, exactly. And in the book, they get into that a little bit more in terms of Paul's visions, because in the movie, it's represented as like, okay, he's following someone through the desert, and everyone around them is starving, and that's a metaphor for whatever you want it to be.
By the way, all that stuff is so well done in this movie.
I think they handled the dream sequences and the visions very well in terms of like they're just vague enough that you can interpret them a bunch of different ways, but they're specific enough that they can really that like the actual overtones of them are very easy to grasp.
I could see different filmmakers getting totally lost in those.
Absolutely, yeah,
yeah, that is real tricky stuff and he does it perfectly, I think.
But the idea that Paul, sees this future of starvation, whatever that means, and knows that even if he dies, that happens. And the only that fucking shot in that movie when they focus on the deep focus on the hand as he says like the slim gap through, it's just like, oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
Because it's his hand that has to guide the thin golden path through.
I think on that point, I mean, he was great in the first movie, but I really think Chalamet is so good in this movie.
That scene where he confronts the War Leader Council was fucking electric.
Yeah. Yeah, incredible. Yeah. I mean, really, and I've never seen him do anything like that. Like, he is such... like him as Paul in the first movie made so much sense as sort of the naive innocent, because that is what he often plays a lot. I sort of think of him as a very sort of, I mean, he's famous for that, right? That's sort of the impression is always he's this very low key kind.
He's the low key sad boy,
yeah. So I went into the second movie going, will he be Paul Muad'Dib? You know, I mean, I believe in him as an actor, but boy, does he make you feel that. And I mean, the thing to me that I keep is when he fucking murders Baron Harkonnen and his "you die like an animal."
Oh, that was so good.
And I just went, oh fuck, like yeah, and just and the same thing at the end of the movie where they're like, yeah, they're signaling they're not gonna go with you on they're not gonna recognize your authority as emperor, and just that moment he's just like, then launch the ships. Like it's just like then we're going, then we're gonna begin the Holy War,
the completion of the tragedy, right?
Yeah. But it's just at that point he's so in it that he is just like, then that's the next step, and that's just what we have to do. Yeah. But that's the thing. Yeah, that's why I got so upset with that AV Club thing because I'm so glad other people did too. So I'm like, going like, oh, the point of the story is at the end of the day, yeah, Paul's just a piece of shit like everybody else. Like, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is he gets to a point where he realizes where everybody does it, just like, fuck, this is kind of the only thing that happens. Either I'm in charge or that guy's in charge. It's all awful.
Yeah,
there is no way. Like he it's just a doomed path. Like the other alternative was, I guess, just to, because it's sort of like, well, I guess it's better it's me and not that fucking asshole. Like,
Yeah, and something they drive home in the book too is this idea that like he also is aware that even if he dies, he becomes a martyr at a certain point. It's like if Muad'Dib dies, then everyone carries on in his name, and he's not there to guide it in any way.
Exactly, and it is sort of thing where you go like, and that's why you do. It's such a great story because you do feel that in the moment where you're like, I mean, somebody should stop the Harkonnens. That they are awful, but by doing that, you're now creating your own regime. So it's great classic tragedy where you as a viewer are going like, I don't know what I want. Like,
the magic trick of this movie is driving home the tragedy of it. Because I think the other adaptations of Dune, whether you're talking about the Lynch movie or the TV miniseries, end on a note of triumph.
And that was how people read the first book, which kind of was where Herbert was like, "Oh no, wait, what?"
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, Villeneuve has the foreknowledge of where this goes, so can write that tragedy on a broader face in this film.
Because that is not where this movie ends. Number one, it ends with like they've made it very clear that what happens at the end of this movie is going to be horrific. That Paul is going to launch a holy war, and we don't end the movie on Paul. We end on Chani, who abandons Paul, which, and I've seen a lot of people be very. That's the one thing I've seen a couple people be like, "Fuck that shit. She loves him."
But here's the thing. Because of how they've built Chani, and you were right, it lays some big seeds for what's coming in Messiah in terms of Chani's thought process and where the story takes Paul as a character and the reactions of the universe to him and what he's done. Because you have an iron-fisted tyrant rising to replace another one, you're gonna have people who struggle and resist that tyrant. And because... just because Chani was on the quote-unquote winning side doesn't mean she doesn't have the impetus like she has had the whole film to fight that struggle. And that's part of what I loved about the additions to her, is this whole idea of this like Fremen youth culture that doesn't jive with the more traditionalist.
The stuff, the whole first like third of the movie that's basically just everybody laughing at Stilgar for still believing in this prophecy. And he's just like, you'll see it, man. You're gonna see this. Look at this shit, man.
Fucking Javier Bardem walks away with this movie. He really does.
Absolutely. Every the theater I was in, every single thing he said brought the house down. Like he is just. I mean, that's another one. Where it's like hot take. He's a fucking great actor, but really, oh man, you couldn't have asked for a better Stilgar because that character is. So he is the zealot of the group, right? He's the religious fundamentalist, but he's Javier Bardem, so you're never like, this guy's crazy. You are kind of like, this guy though.
Man, that line drop he has was like, oh, not that big when Paul summons the worm was just
my god, such a great and of course, I mean, there are still these moments of. That's the thing I love about the tragedy. There are still these moments of triumph within it, where when he does ride the worm, you're like, oh. Fuck yeah. But then you're also like, oh shit, it's also bad. And that's the same thing when he kills Baron Harkonnen, you're like, fuck yeah, that guy had it coming. Same thing with the, oh my god, the duel with Fayed Roth. Well, Fayed Roth is a whole conversation we're going to have to talk about because Jesus Christ.
I want to let's keep on Chani for a second because I think it's important to like put the nail in the coffin. Zendaya, good actor, turns out.
Really good. I mean, we've known this. She's And I think once again her kind of acting, and this is where both her and Chalamet, and they're so good together, but they are both such grounded performers that they do make you feel these are real people, not pieces of this space opera, like you talk about characters floating in this.
Because one disingenuous complaint I've seen about her performance is this idea of her kind of having a frumpy face the whole movie. But what she's playing is the tear between I see the guy I love being wrapped up in a prophecy he has no control over, and she can see the parts of him that hate it, but also like he's now becoming something she's spent her life resisting. And,
well, something I saw.
I think it's a very good performance, personally.
It's an amazing performance, and because she is doing what the audience is doing, which is as much as we are falling for this guy, we're also really worried about him. Right? Mm-hmm. We are just going like, this is awesome, but also, this guy's super cool, but oh god, this way lies destruction. And she really is the audience surrogate in that case, right? Or we are viewing her. And something I saw in an interview with Villeneuve where he talked about it, he goes, I always, first and foremost, wrote this as a love story. That is at the center of part 2 is a love story, and that is that everything filters through that to him. And he goes, and all kinds of love. It's the love between him and Johnny. It's the love between mother and son, mother and daughter, brother and sister. There's all these things. The movie is about love.
The reason the reaction to Chani is so vehement, I guess, other than just plain old homegrown misogyny, which is rampant in all of this.
I mean, let me say, a lot of the people who are saying this are not people I would. I'm surprised to hear it from.
But she's definitely the character they've taken the most additions to, and her whole story in the film is basically not there in the novel. In the novel, she's barely a character most of the time,
and that is how she feels in the Lynch movie too, right? Yeah. Like she's just and that's why I'm saying, like, and this is not, look, this is not a slam on the book or on Frank Herbert, but she's the character who needs the most added to her, is what I was going to say. I think that's the thing. That's just it exactly, and especially, and once again, that's not to slam the book or whatever, but that's the thing where it's like she's added to because kind of giving her anything is adding to her, right? Like, to a certain extent.
And the big thing that they remove from the Paul and Chani story, which I actually really approve of, is them having a kid within the time span of the first book.
Well, one of the big things he does is condense the timeline, right?
We condense the timeline in a big way. This whole movie takes place in under 9 months.
Yeah, I think
have to, because Jessica's still pregnant.
I think Villeneuve says it's 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas in the book, we do a hard cut to "and years later."
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's like 3 to 5 years that the whole
something
thing,
like that. Yeah.
And that's always the weirdest part of the Lynch movie, when all of a sudden you just have to leap forward a ton of years, and you're like, whoa.
Yeah. Which is maybe more realistic in terms of like a freedom fighting movement, but I think it makes this movie more propulsive to condense that timeline.
Talk about that adaptation thing, right? This is something I had a screenwriting teacher tell me once, which is true. Movies aren't great at conveying long periods of time. Now, there's always exceptions to everything, but in general, it's hard to convey large stretches of time in a movie.
So getting rid of Chani and Paul's first kid that dies unceremoniously off screen in the first book, I think was a good call.
There's another reason why it ends up kind of not mattering. I mean, obviously that's part of their character, but in terms of, you're not missing a huge chunk of story since that character dies anyway.
Yeah. So, and all it really does is, like, in the book, you're basically fridging the kid. That's a comic book term for, like, killing a character just to give another character motivation, which was completely unnecessary because the Harkonnens had already killed his dad and his whole family. So.
And this movie makes that so clear, especially when you get to the Gurney Halleck stuff, that, like, the death of Duke Leto is everything about that. Or it's just like, that's it, you know?
What the compression of the timeline also does, besides like making the relationship between Chani and Paul more propulsive, it nimbly sidesteps the character I was so curious how they were going to handle in this, and that is Paul's sister, Alia.
Yeah. They make her, she's a huge part of the movie without also being in it, really.
Which I think was a very creative, very interesting way of doing it. It does remove one of my favorite scenes from the book, which is unfortunate, and that is when, at the end, when the Emperor is, like, confronting the Baron, and he's like, and we found this random child on the street, and she says she's the sister of Muad'Dib, and then you have this, like, creepy little girl, like, trolling the entire Imperial court.
Lynch is all over that shit, though.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He couldn't wait to put a creepy little kid in the movie. But no, I love all the stuff that they and the way that she continues to be a larger and larger presence in the movie until she's literally Anya Taylor-Joy for a one shot.
That was Anya Taylor-Joy. She's not in the credits, so I wasn't certain. But
it is, because she was at the premiere, and everybody was like, "Are you in this?" And she was like, "Yeah, kind of." Yeah, but they talked about they talked to Villeneuve. They go, "Why didn't you say that was her?" He goes, "I don't know. It's fun to sometimes have surprises in movies still." Like,
I was really surprised. I loved it.
Yeah, it was great, and she's a great choice for that part too.
Especially with like what I know about Alia as a character. Like, I think that's great casting.
Everybody
and really raises some questions, like I say, about what the adaptation of Part 3 even is.
Well, he has said she's going to be a major character in Part 3, of course.
In that case, we're jumping to the events of Children of Dune at some point.
She's
not fully grown in Messiah.
I have no idea what he's doing with that. He did talk about he's in no hurry to make Part 3. He said he thinks he's going to make another movie in between because he's like, if only for my own sanity, I need to get out of the desert for a little while.
Well, and I think it'd be wise to like let the actors involved age up a little bit to like simulate the time jump.
I'm sure Warner Brothers is like, what? No.
But yeah, having Alia be this like unborn presence in the movie added to the surrealist like. Mindfuckery of the spice that I liked.
What I love is you have Jessica at the beginning of the movie going, I'm talking to her, but we don't hear that. And then as the movie goes forward, Paul starts talking, and then we start hearing, and then she becomes this larger and larger presence throughout the whole movie, which is very cool. And it is further adding to, because as the movie becomes more about destiny, right, and stuff like that, and you are going down this path of like, you already know what's going to happen. And you're watching Paul try to avoid it because Paul knows what's going to happen before ultimately that moment when he turns to Chani and says, like, no matter what I do, I love you. And he's right. But he's like, what I'm about to do is going to violate everything you believe about me and want me to be. But I need you to know this before I do it. And I think he's not lying. He does. He absolutely loves it. But he's just like, but this is what's going to fucking happen. I don't know I love that moment. And then her, of course, the thing she says to him is like, she will always love him as long as he remains the person she loves. And that's very, very different.
Yeah.
And he's just like, yeah, but I'm going to be a different person, still love you. You cool with that? And she's kind of like, no.
That brings us to Jessica in what I think is the most interesting swerve with any of the characters they've taken. And maybe not the most interesting, but it's definitely like the one that caught my attention the most.
Yeah.
And that is basically making her an antagonist.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent.
Because she's propelling Paul down this path of like religious extremism and cultivating it in a way that like is implied in the book, but is not as done as malevolently as it is in the film.
I mean, still coming out of like everybody's so coming out of vengeance in this movie and out of rage, right? And so it is malicious, but even still, you get the sense that if you were to watch the whole movie from her perspective, she wouldn't be an antagonist, right? Is sort of that thing about it. And so I think she's on a similar path to Paul, but we're not in her head as much. But it is sort of just like, well, this is what has to be done. Like, I think she's convinced herself that.
Sure.
But it's not the Stilgar thing of complete religious fervor and belief. There is a part of her that knows things are being manipulated, and the more you get into it, and you get into the Bene Gesserit, sort of thing about like, well, actually, we were the ones who planted the prophecy, and all this is kind of horse shit anyway. But then it starts
and Jessica knows that.
What I love about that is like, it's bullshit, but we've done it so well that it's kind of not bullshit anymore. Like it's what even is it? If everyone believes it, then is he a messiah?
Is a strange metaphor for our current political system, wouldn't you say?
It is that thing where it's like, if you just believe something enough, does it become true? And that's the thing I do think. And I mean, there's no way Villeneuve wasn't thinking that, right? I mean, like, there is a thing that's so crazy that is, I think that's enough. Well, it's not even crazy, but I think it is one of the reasons these movies are hitting so hard is just like, now is kind of a perfect time to tell the story of Dune. Right? Like it really is. I think that's a big reason is I think people are really connecting with this story because it does, even though it was written in 1965, or it came out in 1965, it feels very prescient. And he's not changing a lot. And it's doing that thing sci-fi does where it's not overt. It's not, you aren't literally going, okay, well, this is the Middle East conflict and that is that.
But you're talking about a demagogue thrust into power by fanatical masses that are being perpetrated by a large spread lie that is being constituted by individuals who are manipulating information. I wonder what that's a metaphor for.
But the cool thing about it is that demagogue is the main character.
Yeah. No, and
Right.
that's
And so that further makes it, because it'd be real easy to do like the sort of Star Trek thing of our characters enter a world where that's happening and can be like, this is bad. But this movie forces you to go like, I'm with it, but I'm kind of not. Oh God, wait, should I feel bad that I rooted for this? It's just so rich in that, right? It's just so cool that you're just going like, because I do like, I mean, like I said, I do it. Villeneuve does make the movie very propulsive. So when they're blowing shit up and killing Harkin, you're like, fuck yeah, man, get him. And then the end of the movie forces you to go like, was that good? And you're like, but I said like this thing I love is the end of the movie. I'm going like, I mean, yeah, this is bad that a holy war is happening, but also like somebody did have to kill the Harkonnen, right? Like, because those guys shouldn't be in charge either. So I don't know.
Let's talk about them and get to Fade Routha. Obviously, is the like Austin Butler. Just, I mean,
Austin Butler is one of our best actors, right? I mean, that guy. I am such a huge fan of this dude.
Because I am who I am, of course, watching Masters of the Air.
So am I, and he's amazing in it.
Yeah, but he is so much like Elvis adjacent in that movie in terms of like this pretty boy kind of look.
Well, because that's the thing. I love actors I always love actors like him because he reminds me of Gosling a lot in this way, who I also love, of these guys who seem to be fighting being handsome leading men, right? Like they default so, because he's just so conventionally handsome.
He's a very pretty man.
But inside him beats the heart of a super weird character actor.
And that's why we get his Fade Routha in this movie, and I love it so much.
Because you can, and what I love is you can feel his delight at playing this, which works so well because this guy delights in what a sick fuck he is. You know, like
and his like weird Skarsgård impression that he's doing.
Oh, one of the most genius things in this movie is that he's impersonating Skarsgård, playing Baron Harkonnen. Of course, as soon as you started talking, because I was like, obviously the lot was written about he couldn't stop talking like Elvis after he did Elvis, which is weird. And by the way, a movie I don't like at all, but I think he's really, really good in. I think the movie is not good, but I think his performance is amazing in it.
So you're saying it's a Baz Luhrmann film?
Well, I'm saying it's a music biopic, which is always, every music biopic is like, oh, agreed, Rami Malek is incredible as Freddie Mercury, but Bohemian Rhapsody is shit. That happens, and that's what I haven't seen it, but that's what a lot of the reviews for that Bob Marley movie that's out. People go like, oh, Kingsley Ben-Adir is an incredible Bob Marley. The movie is pretty boring or whatever, and whatever. But they always, because it is like, but similar to that, and he's amazing on Masters of the Air as well. I think he's great on there, and that show is excellent. Beautifully made. Surprise. Spielberg and Hank's World War II miniseries are usually pretty good.
They've got a good track record of those.
Yeah. They do it right. But everything in his performance, his whole look. When we're on the Harkonnen planet and it's all monochrome.
Under the Black Harkonnen sun was such a hardcore line that I was just like, yeah, we're going death metal with these guys. I love it.
And it what I love is it comes probably a little more than halfway through the movie, and all of a sudden we got a little taste of it in the first movie, and what we saw of like the way they live their lives, you're like, ew. And then we get a little bit in this movie, but it's mostly with Raban and sort of the running of the spice industry, right? And how that's going. But when we just hard shift to their planet, and you're like, oh God. And the first time we see Fade Routha, they're putting the black on his totally sculpted body, because he put on like 20 pounds of muscle, Austin Butler, to play Fade Routha.
If you're going to spend most of the movie with your shirt off, I feel like you got to commit to it.
Well, and also, I mean, I think he and Chalamet have similar builds. They're both sort of skinny, pretty men, right? Like they are they have, there's a femininity to their attractiveness.
They're lithe.
They're lithe, exactly. So, but he needs to be this guy who sculpted himself into a weapon, so that when he does face Muad'Dib, you're all like, oh shit, this guy might kill him, and he doesn't have a winged Speedo though, so I can't really do it.
No, it's Sting. He is not. This is true.
Did you see Sting's joke about? He said to him, he goes, "You can have it. I still have it if you want to use it."
Oh, gross. I don't want to. I do, and I don't want to know how often Sting still wears that Speedo.
More than you'd think is what I would.
More than I'd think, and like
and less than I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But Fade Routha, I think, is
Yeah.
one of the more important additions to this movie because they make him more of a central antagonist and less of a guy who shows up at the end that Paul has to knife fight with.
Well, because once again, like everything, if you've seen the Dune, the Lynch movie, everyone in that movie just gets truncated, and it's like Duncan Idaho is just like some guy, and you're like, who even is that guy? Just some guy Paul knows. Now he's dead. Like, everything is like that. So I feel like similar to a lot of it, by these movies take their time, because this movie is, what's this, like 2 hours 45? It's a little
it's
under
pushing
3 hours.
3.
2 hours 46 according to IMDb. But man, talk about a movie that, and I'm Mr. Make movies shorter. People have seen me wear my hat on here. But boy, I think this thing really earns every minute of its runtime, and a lot of that is to do what you're talking about, where it's like Fred Routha gets enough that you're like, oh, I get a sense of this guy and what he's about. And also, just what a sick little freak he is. Oh, he's just such a sick little freak.
He's a freaky little boy. But
the amount of throat slashes from this dude. Whew.
It's a lot of throat slashing. He cuts a lot of throats.
Yep.
My favorite addition with him, though, is the mirror of the pain box scene.
Yes.
Was an addition that's wholly for this movie and is just like, really drives home. This is evil Paul.
Yeah. Well, because I love Lea Seydoux, who plays Lady Margot in this movie. When they're talking to him, when she's talking to who's she talking to? I saw it
just
last
Bene
week.
Gesserit person.
Yeah, and I just like when she just goes, "He's a psychopath." Like, it's just like, because they're just like, "Do you think you can convince him to do it?" And she's just like, "He's insane." Like, she does that test and immediately it's like, yeah, he technically passed the test or whatever because he's a fucking psychopath.
Yeah, and he's talking to the Reverend Mother Mohayim and
it's
Princess Irulan. In that, when she's like talking about how the levers were like, okay, if we needed to put this guy in charge and control him, we could.
Talk about a great casting. Also, Charlotte Rampling as Mother Ohio, who's also in the first movie too. Just instant regality behind that. But yeah, just that moment of like, oh boy, this guy. It's like, yeah, we can get him to do what we want, but holy God,
at what cost?
Yeah. When I love the moment when he's doing the gladiatorial combat and they realize one of the Atreides guys isn't drugged, and Baron being like, "This is your gift."
Yeah, your gift is like a real fight where you get to murder somebody in cold blood. Cool.
Yeah. Well, and they talk about an Austin Butler improv, if you will, is the licking of the knife when they hand it to him.
Great.
Which is such a creepy little moment. And then just being like, it's still not sharp enough. And that's how you fucking... What a weirdo, man. And his weird little, like, murder girls are with him.
Yeah, that he keeps feeding people to.
Yeah. What do you want? Yeah.
The Harkonnen society is built up like the fucking Cenobites in Hellraiser.
They really are. They really are. They're so scary, and that was so much the thing in the first movie too. They're just so weird, and there's just enough of them, and they're just vaguely drawn enough that you're like, I don't want to see any more. Get out of here, man. Anytime you're anywhere in their inner sanctum stuff, you're like, God. I mean, you've got the Baron like taking a bath in what looks like oil, and you're like, oh.
Yeah, he loves those oil baths. And I love how the Baron gets more monstrous as this film particularly goes on, because he gets poisoned in the first film by the Baron's, or the Duke's last breath, right?
Right, yeah. Badass.
Showing the consequences of that, making the Baron more like grotesque and monstrous, I think was a really good touch.
Stellan Skarsgård, man. I mean, once again, another legend. Just going for it, and you have to in this part. You can't. You just have to commit 100% to being the most disgusting human being.
Well, and it's so easy in that part to like. I think they ride a fine line with Baron Harkonnen in terms of going between the like physically monstrous and not being it's like so over the top and like eunuch palace intrigue, because in the book he's like explicitly a gay man who like preys on younger men, and like it'd be very easy to lean into certain stereotypes where that's concerned.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, they never, because you get the sense like there is no. There is no word for what's up with this guy. I mean, like a gay man who preys on young men. I mean, that may be a way to frame what he's doing, but like, that doesn't describe like he's into his own sick shit. You know what I mean? Where it's just
what they've done with the Harkonnens in these films is make them like so beyond whatever like stereotypes you could associate them from our world. They are like weird fetish monsters
They've
that are from a different
transcended
dimension.
humanity in a way, right? Yeah, exactly. They are the Cenobites is exactly the right. That's what they've become. They've become people, who are so so fetishistic of death and pain and all the ugliness of the world, and these people just embrace that fully. One of the best moments of the movie is when Paul's army has invaded and him just crawling towards the empty throne.
Oh, yeah. That's very cool. I loved all of the like weird like suspensor stuff built into his spine. Yep. Like just all of the weird bits built onto the Baron.
It's all thought out.
The floating like respirator thing that follows him around.
That's what I mean. Everything feels so detailed without feeling like it's constantly telling you how detailed it is. Everything in the movie just feels so real. Everything's so tactile. All the tech, it's something about, I've talked to a lot of people about, like, I don't know. I mean, obviously, some of it I know, but like, I don't know what's CGI in a lot of places, right? Everything just feels so uniform. I mean, obviously, like giant sandworms are CGI, but I mean, I'm saying like, but I'm talking about like
they imported those from the Georgian deserts.
Obviously, broad strokes things like that, or ships that are flying and stuff like that. But like in moments, in scenes and sets, I can't tell like, oh, well, there's where the set extension goes. There's where that backdrop becomes CGI. Everything is so beautifully rendered, and it's something I think that's very important when people talk about special effects. It's not so much about quality of CGI. It really is about directing. It really is about a uniform vision and making sure everything. And I really think that these movies are a perfect example of when you want to understand what a director does. And it really is about. One of the best descriptions I heard about being a director is you are the one who is managing everything to come to the same point, right? It is about all these people are working independently, but it's got to be a clear vision of they're all working to get at this. And I think that's really why this has such a stamp of Villeneuve on it, even though hundreds and hundreds of other people work on it.
The metaphor I always like where film directing is concerned, because it is simple and easy to grasp.
Yeah, it's a hard job to understand in general, too. So
you're the captain of a ship. There are other people on that ship that know way more than you. The navigator knows the charts. The bosun knows how to keep the ship going. The cook is making the meals. But the captain is the one who has to wrangle all those people to get the ship from point A to point B.
Exactly. And the thing with this is exactly. And that's the thing about it is it's a hard job to understand because it's kind of mysterious in a way, right?
Yeah.
And it's not. You're not able to go, I did that. It's much easier as a costume designer to go, I made that costume. I built this set. I rendered that effect. But as a director, it is just like, yeah, but I made sure that costume, that set piece, and that effect all were in line with each other.
Right. And then obviously you have like editors and effects people who are also making sure that's all composited well together. Mm-hmm. But it is the director, in theory, whose vision is guiding all of that.
In general, obviously now we live in a world where like that person is Kevin Feige at Marvel. But that's also a guy keeping 40 movies in line with each other. You know?
Yeah, and that's where like some of the disharmony that you see people picking up on in like Marvel movies of the last like 4 years or so have been people kind of noticing the seams a little bit where that stuff is concerned.
Sure. But I think that just speaks to how, just like I said, that's where the seamless effects on this. I don't necessarily think like these effects per se are better as other people doing other effects, but it's just about how they're implemented in the movie. These are great effects artists who are being used and directed in a really smart way that this all adds up to this. There's an attention to detail here that is. It's not completely absent from film, but, when you see something like this, or similar to Barbie and Oppenheimer last summer, of just these movies are so beautifully put together in a way where you don't see the seams. It really does feel like, wow, this is a singular work of art.
The other example I like to draw on, because I don't think this movie got enough attention, is The Creator from last year.
Oh, yeah.
Because, like, say what you will about that movie, I think it has its ups and its downs, but the creative vision
you
behind
were hotter on it than I was, yeah, but yeah.
Yeah. I think it makes a cohesive world in a way
I think that is the
a lot of other movies don't.
I agree. I think that is the strength of it, and that is always my thing. I think Gareth Evans, Edwards?
Gareth Edwards, yeah.
I get confused because Gareth Evans is the guy who makes the Raid movies. The fact that there are two different British filmmakers named Gareth with an E last name is Gareth Edwards. I struggle with him because I do think he's a brilliant visual filmmaker, but I don't know that he's a great writer. That's my only I'll leave. I'll see myself out. Look,
to each their own. Like, art is subjective, right?
Yeah, no, for me, his scripts often don't work. That's just for me.
And with a director, you don't necessarily have to have them be the script person. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't help sometimes if the director of a big project like this also has a hand on the story.
Yeah, I mean, Villeneuve, he has a writing credit here. And I wanted to look. Does he have writing credits on all of his movies? No. In fact, he only has writing credits on the Dune movies.
Oh, interesting.
These are the only movies he's directed, at least in his American films, that he is also a screenwriter on.
He doesn't have a writing credit on Arrival? That actually shocks me.
He does not?
Huh. Cool.
These were script. I mean, as with everything, once the production process begins, it's hard to know if he did writing without getting credit. I mean, we know that getting credit on a script kind of almost means very little, actually, weirdly.
Yeah, because you don't know what's changing day to day on set, and you don't know, like, what the director's input, even on the, like, time when the script is being written, is filtering through.
Yeah, and especially the other and especially on movies like this, I think the Dune movies are kind of rare examples where 80 people didn't work on it.
Yeah,
because we know a lot of stuff goes through. They bring in people. I mean, I was just listening to an interview with Alexander Payne, who's one of my favorite filmmakers, but he does a lot. He makes little indie films, but he does a lot of script doctoring work. And he was talking about, like, yeah, I actually did a week on Detective Pikachu. And you're like, what? And he goes, oh, they'd already finished filming. They just needed like ADR lines. So, like, he has no credit anywhere, and he worked for 1 week to write dialogue that would fix scenes so they fit better together on Detective Pikachu.
I do love Detective Pikachu, so good job.
It's a surprisingly good movie. It actually is and it actually, on that, it did work because it actually holds together really well. It's pretty strong.
Another example of, like, really cohesive world building that they did.
Actually, yeah. I was very surprised. I think everybody was. That movie's pretty solid.
It's like, we were all expecting to be given permission to shit on Detective Pikachu, and then everyone walked out of that movie going like, oh, damn, I think that was actually really good.
Well, it is called Detective Pikachu. I mean, to be fair,
exactly.
Act against it. So, so if it was doing a Pokemon movie, that would have been a different thing. But the fact, Detective Pikachu specific, okay. Whereas I think the exact opposite is the case of Dune, where people were like, oh, you're going to make Dune, eh?
Yeah, no, because it is, like you say, such a monolith in science fiction specifically. It is sort of heralded as, like, the grandfather of science fiction novels as we know them. Because before Dune, there was, like, a lot of, like, pop and pulp sci-fi and, like,
Flash Gordon.
Yeah. But Dune, like, nobody would publish Dune because it was too long, and that's, like, not even a consideration people think about anymore.
Well, now especially, it feels like in sci-fi and fantasy, it's almost like a badge of honor to go, mine was 1,000 pages,
right. But, like, Frank Herbert had to get a company that mostly printed manuals for diesel engines to publish Dune.
Yeah, that is one of those crazy stories. Somebody will make a movie about that, I'm sure, at some point.
I mean, the same is true for Tom Clancy. Isn't that the whole thing with, like, Hunt for the Red October?
Yeah. Dude was working as an insurance agent,
And, like, he had to get, like, some company that, like, mostly did, like, boat manuals to publish his book.
Mm-hmm. It kind of reads that way sometimes. I love Clancy, but you talk about a guy who gets lost in the weeds on stuff. Where you just go like, oh, 3 pages about the engines of the submarine work. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, Small Academic Naval Institute Press of Annapolis. He literally got published by the Navy's publishing arm.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Why not?
I
Hey,
mean,
whatever
these
gets you
guys.
there.
Yeah, well, because essentially, I mean, they weren't. But Clancy similar. Both I think Herbert and Tolkien, while we're comparing those, are similar things where it's like those were turning points in those genres. It's not like nobody had written sci-fi and fantasy before those things, but they so blazed new trails, and you can chart so many things back to it, right? You can chart so much back to Dune. I mean, so much so it's always the thing we joke about that Herbert was always like, I could have sued George Lucas. I didn't, but I could have, you know. But you know, because there is a lot of, but Star Wars isn't alone. Everything, I mean, almost all sci-fi after Dune. There's like before and after Dune, right? And particularly in space-based stuff. And same thing with Tolkien. I mean, we talk about that. It's kind of one of my problems with a lot of fantasy stuff is I feel like there's too much of repetition. Some of my irking with particularly high fantasy is it all feels like Lord of the Rings,
because tropes are established of like, this is how fantasy works, or this is how sci-fi works. Let's not rag on fantasy too much. I want sci-fi tropes. You need something to circumvent time dilation when traveling large distances in space. Every sci-fi franchise that it's like space operatic has that, whether it's warp or hyperspace, or Dune has navigators from the guild, which actually like weirdly absent from all of these movies.
That was the biggest. I also saw this with my friend Jerry, who's a huge fan of the novels, and that was like the first thing he said. Where were the navigators?
Which, in fairness, do not appear in the first book.
Oh, well, there you go. There's the end. Well, because they don't really need to, right? I mean, like we don't
supposed
really
to be mysterious and weird.
But we don't really. I mean, after we go to Arrakis in the first movie, we're kind of there for the rest of it, right? Basically, like we don't really have to go many places.
The only place I could even
it doesn't have a lot of planet hopping like a lot of space stuff does.
No, and in fact, like that's pretty much Frank sticks to Arrakis basically for most of his series, until the last two books start hopping around a little bit more. But even then, like,
that makes sense, right?
See the green paradise that Arrakis becomes.
But I mean, that makes sense, right? Because as presented here, it really is whoever controls Arrakis controls the galaxy or whatever, right? Like, that is the thing. It's like this is in the capitalistic society of this is everything.
Yeah. I mean, this is oil. This is insert replacement for valuable resource here.
Totally.
The spice must flow.
And that's where it's like, of course, you can draw instantly the Middle East comparison because obviously the desert. And there's sort of vaguely, I think correct me if I'm wrong, because you've certainly read it much more than I have. The novel is a little bit more expressly Middle Eastern in some of the culture.
Yes and no. It's definitely a lot of like,
I mean, because
Frank Herbert looked up a bunch of phraseology that's like vaguely Middle Eastern and like twisted it.
Yeah, I mean, Muad'Dib does have that sort of like.
Sure, and like I said, phraseology that's been twisted in some way, and like Shai Hulud, the old man of the desert, is like an Arabic term, not referring to sandworms, obviously.
Right. What?
But like, but Shaitan is like the Islamic Satan.
Right.
But yeah, and like there are great lengths that are going to later by Brian Herbert to like imply that they take like one or two lines that are said in the original novels and then talk about how like Buddhism and Islam at some point in the past sort of fused into one religion. It's very
odd. I was gonna say, like, that's the kind of stuff I don't want, right? I think the further obfuscation, the better in this stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The more you start to get into that, the more I'm like, now I'm getting uncomfortable.
Yeah,
and that's something I do like. I was going to bring that up as a compliment of the movies. I like that the movies do. I like the way the Fremen are cast with a ton of different ethnicities of actors and stuff, right? That there's no. It's not just because it would. Oh God, I mean, you could imagine the movie where they're all played by Middle Eastern actors, and it is very uncomfortable to sit through.
Yeah. Can I talk about like the one highlight? Like tertiary character that I was surprised showed up as much in this movie. I'm gonna struggle. I'm gonna butcher his last name, but Babs Olusanmokun.
Oh, he's great.
Who people would probably recognize as Dr. Mbenga from Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
Yeah,
he shows up in the last Dune movie as Jameis, and we have that duel between Paul and Jameis at the end of the film that sort of inducts Paul into Fremen society. The fact that he kept showing up as like the Fremen voice in Paul's head throughout this movie,
so
I thought
by the end of the movie,
touch.
So by the end of the movie, he's literally asking for the guidance of that character, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. Number one, fantastic actor. As we did a whole episode about Strange New Worlds. He's amazing in it. Mbenga is such an amazing character. Super talented dude. And yeah, maintains a huge presence in this movie. He's great. Yeah.
And it was just another shocking addition for me. It was just like, oh, makes total sense. I think is not wasting this great actor for like a couple of scenes in the first movie, having him be a continuation. It really cements this film as a part 2 and not a sequel, right? Like, we now exist in the space where Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2 are never going to be disconnected as films, really.
No, and I remember that was a criticism that some people had of the first movie. It was like, oh, no ending here. And actually, one could argue there's actually not really an ending here either. I mean, there is. I mean, that was the thing that struck me about this, is just like, oh God, I didn't realize how much it really is like. Oh no, he doesn't just he's not just going like, maybe I'll make a part 3. He's calling his shot. We're going to part 3.
Yeah. Like part 3's got to happen at this point, right?
And it's guaranteed anyway with the amount of money this thing's bringing in. Like I said, I just hope they give him the time to do it and don't just be like, come on, we need more money. Because they very much, Warner Brothers sees huge dollar potential in Dune as an entire shared universe. We should mention, boy, though, things are not going great on that Bene Gesserit show because they keep having to recast. They brought in new showrunners. They keep rethinking it.
It's a hard premise to crack, and I think is a very difficult thing to even approach.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about a society of politically manipulative eugenics experts, making them the main focus of your show, I feel like is your first big mistake. Having the Bene Gesserit in a show, great, cool. They're a very cool, interesting faction that we can deal with in this universe. But calling your shot of calling it, what is it, Dune Sisterhood or something?
Dune Prophecy.
Oh, they renamed it?
They were going to call it Dune the Sisterhood, and now it's Dune Prophecy.
Okay.
And John Spaeths, who's the co-writer of this, was going to be showrunner and developed it, and then according to him, left to work on Dune Part 2, but other people are saying they didn't like what he was doing, so they fired him. Denis Villeneuve was going to at least direct some of it, but then he no longer had time to direct any of it, so he's been out. They cast people, then fired the cast and brought in new people. It's been all over the place. It has really been, and I think they have shot it. Yeah, they retitled it at the end of last year, Dune Prophecy. I don't like that title.
Oh wait, so it's all filmed already?
Resulting. Oh no! They started shooting. And then their director, the guy they brought in to replace Villeneuve, then quit the show
while they were in mid-production.
They also lost their showrunner, and they brought in, so they have a new showrunner now.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I don't. It was originally scheduled to start filming in November of 2020. It began production in 2022, but then it had to stop. Then the guild strikes happen, and that's okay. So they have finished filming.
Okay.
Yeah. So it has been filmed. They finished filming in December of last year.
Well, I guess.
And sometimes late this year, they're saying it'll be out. Oh man, I don't know. Number one, I'm not like super, because like I said, like the world of Dune is not incredible. I mean, it's not interesting but it is like, I like the story of Dune. I'm not necessarily like dying to see corners of it Because it's kind of not fun. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have the same thing as like, ooh, what cool part of like the Star Wars universe or the Star Trek universe. Dune seems like it's fucking depressing. And the Bene Gesserit are interesting to me, but it's always that thing about like, but are they interesting in the context of this? Or are they interesting on their own, you know?
And that's what I guess they have to prove with this show is
that's always
whether or not
to me.
It's because especially renaming it Prophecy really speaks to me of just like, is this show just going to be that, I bring it up again, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. thing where at the, like in season 2 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., or in season 1, they're like, we're waiting for some big event to happen, and then a movie happens, and then the show has to respond to that.
Well,
is this show just going to be, we're waiting for this prophecy to go off, and then the Dune movies happen?
According to the Wikipedia, it is set 10,000 years before Dune.
That's insane.
That's
for
what
reasons I can go into, but it has to do with the Brian Herbert novels I talked to about people fighting robots.
Because according to this, it will focus on the creation of the Bene Gesserit.
So are we going... Oh my god, okay. So is it post-Butlerian Jihad? This is me now, like, thinking in my brain.
The main characters are Valia and Tula Harkonnen.
Okay, because that's a thing in the Brian Herbert novels, is like the origin of the Atreides Harkonnen feud that does go back to that war that humanity had to fight against robots that like launched them into space.
Seems like they're covering some of that ground, right? I mean, it must
interesting. Okay, I mean, it's got to be post Great Revolt. This is just me talking to myself now. Sorry, John.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know much about this. This just seems crazy. I mean, like I said, the thing, regardless of what's said about the fact that they seem to have really struggled to figure out what this show is not a good sign.
Do you remember that Battlestar Galactica prequel show they tried to do, Caprica?
Caprica, of course, yeah.
It's gonna feel like that.
I didn't like that. I don't think that's a hot take. I don't think anybody watched that.
It was a lot of like, oh, and this is a thing that shall be the precursor to that other thing that you really liked.
It's the thing, and I think he either said it to me. No, I think he said it on the show in one of our archives. But our buddy Ibrahim Mustafa, I always think of whenever they announce prequels to anything. He said the problem with prequels is, do you want to see the story you love before all the cool shit happened?
Yeah.
And that to me is always the hurdle to get over. And there are plenty of prequels that do that. But that is always the starting place of my idea for prequels. Is just like, yeah, but if that was so interesting, why didn't it start there? And it's much easier when, oftentimes I like the prequels that just have nothing to do with it, you know, or just like, it's set in that world before. Star Wars has done a lot of that, right? I mean, I'm not talking about the actual prequels things, but like Knights of the Old Republic and stuff. It's like, it kind of doesn't matter. Like, it's so far removed. It's not directly seeding like Skywalker stuff necessarily.
Yeah, no.
And so this, though, sounds like, how can it not be, right? Because it's still Harkonnen and Atreides, you know.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to see if it goes into like the beginning of that feud, if they even try to use any of the Brian Herbert stuff that is centered around that era, which would be insane to me, but would also be pretty interesting for them to even try.
He and Anderson are producers on it. I mean, I don't know how much they're actually involved, obviously, but... And also,
I feel like you get a producer credit if you own the IP, right?
Yeah, although apparently Kim Herbert is heavily involved in this.
Is that...
That's
I don't know who
Frank's
that is
daughter.
in relation. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. Look, I hope it's good. I want it to be good. I want Dune to be a huge, successful multimedia franchise.
I want anything to be good. That's always the thing. I just am like, this is... I am... That's why I'm being very cautious. I'm not exactly excited for it. I'm like, we'll see. I mean, I'll certainly watch at least the pilot, because just out of curiosity. But yeah, it just feels like, I don't know, man. They've gone through 3 directors, multiple sets of casts. They're on like their 4th showrunner, and it hasn't even come out yet. It was supposed to come out years ago. I don't know, man. It also feels like very much like, oh man, we see Game of Thrones money. I mean, that's HBO's always trying to get back to Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah, and having any kind of production kind of limp to the finish line always makes you go like, oh no, buddy. No.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, look, I know they have House of the Dragon now, but they had like 2 other Game of Thrones prequels that never got out of the pilot stage. So
yeah.
And now I think they're in development on at least 2 more Game of Thrones prequels.
Sure, look, develop all you want. Give some actors and showrunners and production people some work, but
Yeah, but it's just like, I don't know, man. I just think, once again, it is that thing about really, other than Marvel, it's been very hard for anything to have really set up a universe. I think Star Trek. I mean, Star Trek actually got there before Marvel in some ways, though it was always just sort of incidental.
Weirdly, Godzilla has the best like film franchise of connected movies at this point.
Yeah, actually, other than they've managed to kind of eke it out. Well, I think one of the things, and I'm not a big fan of those movies, but I think one of the things in defense of the Legendary thing is they have just kind of stuck with it. You know, I mean, they have rolled with, oh, that one wasn't as successful. Well, let's make that still canon, but kind of steer the franchise in a new direction. I think a lot of the problems is companies put stuff out, it doesn't quite go, and then rather than like try to steer the whole thing, and they just go, hey, just start again or give it up. You know, I think
one of the completely knee-jerk opposite reaction to something.
Yeah, I think Legendary has been smart to just sort of like they're just sort of massaging the thing into place as it's going.
Yeah, and I think they've landed on a tone, at least in the last few movies.
It does feel that way.
Big bombastic. We're getting to like the Showa era, like big silly monster fights is what we're here for. You can get your dramatic Godzilla movies with the Japanese films, but the American ones are the like, you want to see two monsters blow up a city? We got you, bud.
We got you. So yeah, obviously, highest of recommends for Dune Part 2. You have to, folks.
It's weird that we're steering towards an end to this episode when like this movie's just really good. It's tough to like. This episode's gonna clock shorter than the Madam Web episode.
Well, it's a thing that we talk about this all the time over on Meet the Monsters. Our episodes for bad movies are always way longer because we can go like, in this scene, what were they thinking? You know, whereas this is just a lot of the time when we like movies on there, we're just like, that part, no, it's awesome.
Yeah, like, awesome. Look, sandworms coming through the fucking sand at the end of the movie. That's fucking awesome.
The thing about this, every one of the big moments delivers like crazy, right? I mean, it's just like I said, the final duel is badass. Gurney Halleck killing Raban. I love that wasn't a fight. Yeah. I love that he just put a knife in his throat and he's like, that's for my Duke.
I will say this movie does remove one of my favorite scenes from the book, and that is Gurney suspecting Jessica of being the traitor to the house, which is actually like a plot line they sort of just remove entirely from part 1 and part 2, is just like the suspected traitor aspect of it.
I get that. I mean, I get why, just for the sake of stuff. You know about the deleted characters, right?
There are deleted characters? No.
Yeah, Tim Blake Nelson was in this movie and got cut out entirely.
I was wondering why he had a special thanks at the end of the film.
He was in it and got let's see.
I'm guessing he played Count Fenring?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, he's a Count Fenring guy.
The scenes shot with Thufir Hawat and
interesting.
And Fenring, they were cut out of the movie.
Because Thufir is like the mentat they have in the first movie, who sort of just disappears at the end of the first movie.
Click on who that is. Yes, yes, of course I remember him in that. Yeah, he was in the movie and got cut.
In the book and in actually the Lynch film as well. The Harkonnens capture him and use him as their mentat for years.
Yeah. So he shot a scene, and Tim Blake Nelson shot a scene as Fenring. But they were cut out of the movie, and those scenes will never be seen because you saw Villeneuve's comment about he never releases deleted scenes.
Yeah, because his whole mentality, and I respect it, but I also would love to see those scenes, is just like, I am the director, the cut you see is my cut, and that is what the movie shall stand as for all time.
That is the movie. I don't want anyone to think, and I get that because, you know, sometimes you do see deleted scenes and then you get whole like think pieces about would the movie have been better with this, and I'm sure he's just like, I don't want you to even think about it. You know what? The movie is the movie. If I wanted anything else in there, it would have been in there. But Tim Blake Nelson is like, man, I'm super boring. He goes, I had a great time. I loved going over there and doing it, but you know.
Yeah. Look, and did I want Count Fenring? Yes, because in the books, who Fenring is like the dead end of the Paul Vader-Rautha lineage of the prophecy. I was like, okay, they're trying to create the Kwisatz Haderach, and like there are a bunch of failed attempts along the way, and Fenring is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, and that, but I also get why you would cut that too.
Yeah, totally. Like
You know,
it is interesting, and it's world building, and it doesn't really have a place in this movie.
you talk about the Gurney Halleck thinking that Jessica's the traitor also is like, that's good in isolation, but that probably would have distracted from the movie, right? If this is a singular narrative, is
right, and you would have had to have set it up in part 1, which they
right.
didn't.
And I think that was a. You do get Gurney singing in this, though.
You did get Gurney singing and playing his 9-string baliset, which I like that. What's his name? Josh Brolin gets a song credit at the end of this movie.
Well, because apparently Hans Zimmer called him and said, "You got any idea for lyrics?
Oh, that's
I'm going to write a thing if you want to write the lyrics."
That is something we haven't talked about at all. Is Hans Zimmer, and
I mean, I think because in some ways, number one, one of my long-standing statements about film in general is I think Hans Zimmer is taken for granted. But I think also we just did that because we take for granted that his score continues to be great from the first movie.
I think I need to re-listen to this part 2 soundtrack specifically, but the way it builds on the themes of part 1 and like twists some of them specifically for the Harkonnen bits, man, Hans Zimmer is clearly having a great time. I think he can phone in some scores sometimes. He's not doing that here.
No, and I think let me say though, I think the amount of stuff he phones in is greatly overstated because people just go like, Zimmer," you know, and you're like,
yeah, they think, "Wah."
Yeah, which is like he. By the way, that's like 2 movies too. I
know.
No, yeah, that's the thing where I just go like, I think the other thing is people don't realize how eclectic he is, right? If you go through filmography, you're like, wow, he's done all kinds of cool stuff. You know, I mean, do you know he's been doing The Simpsons since 2017? He's been doing Simpsons, yeah. He's composed.
That's his day job.
He's composed 100. He's produced 143 episodes of score for The Simpsons.
God bless Hans Zimmer.
Yeah. Once again, he's not out there asking for credit on that, or anything beyond. There you go. Yeah.
But no, I think I'm gonna have to. I mean, look, I've listened to the Dune Part 1 soundtrack a lot.
I'm not shocked to hear that.
Yeah, I have the Hans Zimmer sketchbook is something he put out around the release of the first movie, which is like his like first drafts and like noodling tracks of like the themes we'd eventually get in Dune. I have that on vinyl and it's fucking awesome.
Nice.
And I think this is solidly my favorite of his scores for just how like out there it is. It just sounds so different than any other film score.
It's really good. I have such love for a lot of his stuff that I can't fully go there, but I do think it's certainly among his best work. There's no question about that. You know, but look, I'm still obsessed with his Crimson Tide score from the 90s. So, you know, but and he's worked with Villeneuve before. He also did Blade Runner 2049, which is an incredible score. He did the last SpongeBob movie, like, you know.
Sure, why not? Yeah,
like he's a guy. He did the Creator that you just were talking about too.
Yeah.
You know what?
I like the score of that movie too.
You know what's interesting? He also did Kung Fu Panda 4. He has 2 movies out in theaters right now.
He has 2 movies out this weekend.
The top 2 movies of the box office are both scored by Hans Zimmer. Good for you, Hans.
Has he done all the Kung Fu Pandas? Now I have to look.
Well, he's done the Boss Babies, I'll tell you that.
Okay.
He did both Boss Babies. He did Kung Fu Panda 3, so I think yes.
I think he has done all the Kung Fu Pandas. Yeah. Oh my God, that's great.
That's the thing I think that when I say people take for granted or write him off that way is I don't think people realize how different he is, or the Bois thing is like, I don't think you realize this because I don't think people know how many scores he actually does, right? Like he's kind of he's sort of that he's a real chameleon in that way. Like it really is. When you look through it, you go like, he did that, and he does video games and TV shows and all kinds of stuff. I mean, you know,
he does a bunch of like nature documentary stuff.
Yep, he's done all the Planet Earth shows and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, he's very super talented. You know, once again, hot take, and he does have his Oscar. I think he just have the one Oscar, but his Oscar was for the original Lion King, which, you know, I mean, come on, man.
Yeah.
Come on.
The fact that he didn't, because he was nominated for Dune Part 1.
I have to look now to see what his awards are. But I know he has 2 Oscars, and what is the other one for? I know one is for Lion King, and if the computer would load, I could tell you what the other one was. Uh, welcome back to Zimmercast.
But anyway,
Yeah.
it's just like, something that's said about film score is that if done properly, like you're not even really thinking about it because it's just heightening the mood of the film, right? But especially in the IMAX sound, some of the sound design in this film like demands to be heard.
To me, I both agree and disagree with that, right? That like film score should be invisible or whatever. And some of that is just I think you and I are score nerds, right? Like I have an ear out for the score of a movie because it's interesting.
Yeah.
Brendan always talks about. He goes, "Oh, unless it's like bad, I don't notice it." He takes repeat viewings for him because I'll just go like the score was amazing. He's like, was it? I kind of didn't. He did win the Oscar for Dune Part 1.
Good.
That was his second Oscar. So he has one for Lion King and one for Dune.
Do you think because he won for Dune Part 2 or Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2 gets snubbed next year?
Yeah, that's the kind of thinking they have. There's a lot of shit like that where you go like, this person didn't win because they already have one, you know.
And like I said, I need to re-listen to the Dune Part 2 soundtrack to like really pick it apart.
Well, one of the big things he added, and I did read everything, was talking about developing a love theme for Paul and Chani is one of the big additions to this movie because that really isn't the thing. Also, like the Fied Rauthus theme and stuff like that. There's some darker sounds to it as well. We didn't really talk actually about two of the other new additions, which we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Florence Pugh and Christopher Walken.
Walken's a good actor. Hot take.
Brendan and I were talking about this after the movie. We were just going, he's so good in this, of course, but he's also just always walking, which is great. So when he's like, Muad'Dib, you know, it's like just hearing him talk about this stuff, but he is just, I mean, and the guy, I love Florence Pugh talking about, I read an interview with her where she talked about, she's like, I was so nervous, you know, because almost all my scenes are with this legend. And then she talks about like, before the first take, he's just like, did you see what kind of donuts they have at craft service? And what I love about that is like, he's been doing this so long that he can be this good while also thinking, I'm going to have a bear claw after this take. You know, like he's just, this is a guy who is just in the pocket. It's something I heard recently about working with Jack Nicholson. I have to imagine it sounds like Walken's the similar way, where it's just like, well, I'm going to put the camera here, here, and here. Does that sound good to you? And Nixon goes, I'll justify whatever you do. Like, just tell me where to go. Mm-hmm. And he's also like, don't fuck around with like trying to just tell me, do you want it faster? Do you want it louder? And it seems like guys like that who have been around forever, just like, I know exactly where to turn my face. You tell me to do it louder, I'll give you that. Where it is just like, they're just pros.
Yeah.
And
I really, his performance is, for a Walken performance, is pretty understated.
It really is. I mean, he once again, and I think that similar to a lot of actors like him, right, who are sort of known as these big personalities, really good actors know where to fit that into a movie. So he brings his energy to the level of this movie.
He is a Walken with the weight of the universe on his shoulders, and he plays it.
Oh God, he does that because it's like he feels so old and like down in this movie, but then you see him like on Severance and he's full of energy again or something like that. So it's like he is able to play into like, I'm a man, who's been beaten down by the world.
And that's one of the changes from the book that I have seen people get like flustered about, I guess, because it's like a weird pedantic change that in the Dune universe, someone who consumes a decent amount of spice, their aging is slowed down a lot. So it's a thing in the books that like, the Emperor looks like a 40-year-old man, but he's actually 170 or something. But I think that's justifying the look of him in this movie is you need to sell that he's a guy who's being crushed by the weight of all the galactic politics that he has to wrangle.
Well, there you're talking about the difference between a movie and a book, right? As a book can make that clear. A movie, it would be weird to watch, right? If this was John Hamm.
Yeah.
It wouldn't feel the same. It just would. It wouldn't feel.
Or if they tried to make like young Walken, that would be weird.
Right? Yeah. It just doesn't look right. You need a guy who, because also you only get so much of him in this movie that you need to instantly. And the second he shows up in those robes with that posture, with that quietness in his voice, Because I think that's also something people always do, big walking up here, but sometimes he gets real low and quiet.
Yeah.
You
No,
know,
and
that's,
you think of Walken as the caricature, not as the actor.
yeah, I think Pacino's in that same category too, where it's like, he isn't always screaming in movies, right? uh, and sometimes De Niro can have big energy, So it's like, yeah, these guys have been around so long, they've all become impressions. But then if you actually watch their work, like you'll be shocked at how subtle Pacino is in The Godfather,
Right.
or but yeah, it's great. Sure, yeah. When he's in a Tim Burton movie, Walken's a fucking cartoon character. But when you see him in this, he just and also he conveys that, but he's still also, because he's Walken, makes you, that's the fucking emperor, like he carries with him. They talked about, I saw an interview with Austin Butler and Timothy Chalamet. They talk about like the guys we're intimidated by are like Bardem and Brolin, and then they're like, oh shit, that's Walken. Like all of a sudden, even they are like, oh my god, that's Christopher Walken.
Yeah.
And that's so important that be the way people act towards him.
And he has to sell a guy who has made the terrible choice of having to destroy House Atreides and having that come and bite him in the ass.
Yeah.
Play all that in the like 3 scenes he's given.
Well, because the Harkonnens are obviously like insane, right? But aside from that, there really aren't like, there's not a lot of villains. Like that's the thing. It's like the Emperor isn't like a bad guy necessarily. He's done something terrible, but he justified why it needed to be done. But now it's like, was it? It's like, I guess not. Like, oh, okay.
Right.
And that's a thing about leadership, right? It's like sometimes you're going to make decisions at the moment seem right that, like, upon reflection, that was a huge, huge mistake.
And you don't know what the ripple effects of those decisions are going to be.
Yeah.
And that's a big theme in Dune, is like you make decisions, you justify them in the moment, but where those decisions end and where those ripples go out to, you have no control over.
Let's talk about Florence Pugh then as Princess Irulan, who is a really interesting character in sort of her. You're not quite sure where she's coming down in this, I feel like.
And that's the characterization of her in the first book is so interesting because she is a character only through reflecting on the events from the future until she is a character that shows up at the very end of the book. And having her be the objective voice of truth throughout the book, right up until she isn't, when you realize that, like, oh no, she's someone who's thrust into a political marriage, so that, like, recolors everything you've read up till this point in terms of just, like, she's writing from a cage later. That is the perspective of the person writing those first little tidbits you're reading at the beginning of every chapter. And her character is, I don't know, it's definitely an interesting, like, perspective to have in the book, but you can't do that in a movie. It's just impossible.
So she seems like the person who's trying to, the way I read her in this movie, she's the one who's trying to get to some kind of objective truth in this, right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
It's like there's all these machinations and there's all these people with these grievances and that. What's really going on here?
But ultimately, she is also an agent of the Bene Gesserit.
Right.
And whether or not she plays into their machinations is something they leave a large open space to be played with in a third film, and is something that is played with in Dune Messiah and Children of Dune.
Because that is something I kind of felt about the her in this movie is like, yeah, she's somebody who's trying to get to, trying to be above all the machinations, even though she's already in them, whether she likes it or not, right? It's sort of the thing with, you're already part of this, even though it's like, well, no, I don't really want to be, but well, you're too late. You got pulled into it. Like, she was born into it, and then further pulled into it by having to marry Paul.
Yeah, and something they don't really address in this movie, and something that's barely addressed in the book, is the idea that, like, the Emperor is so manipulated and so, like, entrenched in the Bene Gesserit schemes that he has only been producing daughters, and so he has no, like, legitimate heir, and that's all part of the Bene Gesserit scheme, and so that Irulan is just, like, the last and final, and she's going to be married off because that's just how the Empire has to continue.
Right.
And there's this, like, fatalism to that Irulan sort of, like, embodies in this movie that I liked.
Well, that's the thing, exactly. It all is further getting at this. There is no way to escape this cycle.
Yeah.
Which is the tragedy of it.
The only way that this cycle is stopped is by Paul's son fusing with sandworms and becoming a weird god emperor.
Yeah, I mean, and at a certain point, it's like, I know that's going to happen, but we're already down that path. Like,
Yeah.
And that's I said. I think that's where I don't like the idea that anyone would just be like, oh yeah, so Paul ended up being the bad guy the whole time. You're like, no, that's a gross oversimplification.
Yeah.
And really makes it seem much lesser than the story that it is.
Well, and that's part of the reason why the Brian Herbert books and a lot of the material he's produced after Frank Herbert's death is looked down on a little bit, is because he simplifies it to a good versus evil conflict, man versus robots ultimately creating evil clones of Paul Atreides. It's like it simplifies things too much and sort of ignores the themes that are laid down in the first few Dune books.
One of the things I think both of us really respond to in science fiction in particular, and the best science fiction, is there aren't easy answers. Sci-fi is a way to discuss the issues of the world and not give in. That's why I love Star Trek so much, right? Like, Star Trek is about trying to, come at things from a moralistic standpoint, but sometimes I don't fucking like, what is the right decision? I don't know. Like, it's really, I think some of the more recent Star Wars stuff has done that. That's why I love Andor so much, right? Is they are taking something that it's kind of the inverse of Dune, right? It's taking something that started very clearly black and white and really complicating it more and more.
Yeah. No, and those gray spaces are where a lot of interesting stories can be told. And
Absolutely.
So when you reduce them to an ultimate bad guy or an ultimate good guy, it makes them simple in like kind of a very reductive way that can feel like you're talking down to your audience.
Right, because and that's why I like about, once again, the sort of systemic tragedy of Dune, right, is Baron Harkonnen, Fayed Rath, these are objectively bad people. But they're more than just their own. It is like, what do they represent within the thing? Then we start to filter out into the Emperor and all that stuff. And then also, is Paul a good person? Well, he's better than them.
And like a franchise that deals with this a lot, and it can be lost on people who enjoy the franchise, is Warhammer 40K. Is like, there are no good guys, is like a premise within that. It's just like, no, the system is so fucked up and the universe that these people exist in is so bleak and grim and dark that like what you call a good guy can't exist and function here. And Dune is similar to that in some ways, where it's just like, now the systems in place where humanity exists at this point is a feudal society in which like the people with the best intentions still have to make terrible decisions in order to like thrive and function.
Yeah, it's like it's because it's awful what happens, but I still, like, when I get to the end of the movie, I'm like, I don't know what other decision Paul really could have made.
Right, exactly, and that's the whole a phrase that isn't said in this movie, but is such a big part of the book, is terrible purpose.
Yeah.
And I think what this movie does, while it never says those lines out loud, it makes it clear that that is the theme of the movie, is a terrible purpose.
Because I sort of look at the end of the movie as like, he is making a terrible decision that is the least terrible decision, basically, right? Like,
you hope
that of what appears to be on the table.
Yeah.
But like, it's going to be bad no matter what. Yeah, it's great stuff. I mean, it's really, really
good movie.
Really strong. And also, I mean, it's good. A rare moment where I'm going to be good on Warner Brothers, though, for letting him make this movie. I mean, obviously part 2 a bunch easier to get across, but for believing enough in this filmmaker and the team he's assembled to tell what is not on paper the most mainstream box office fodder.
No, because, like we say, there's no happy ending here. There's no triumph of the hero at the end of this film. You walk away from this movie there's no like Avengers Assemble moment that you have at the end of Endgame that leaves everyone feeling triumphant and victorious. And even though you have some sad denouement in that movie, there is this like triumph battle cry.
Yeah.
The battle cry at the end of this movie is Paul's failure.
Well, I mean, that's the thing that's interesting is you do have that moment here, but the impact of it is considerably different.
Yeah, and I love that you're able to twist that and get that across in this film, because I don't think any other adaptation really has.
Well, exactly, and I think that's why it's so key that it is Chani who we end with, who really is the audience surrogate in a lot of ways, and her sort of devastation at this, but also the devastation of almost like, oh, well, damn myself for believing it was ever going to go a different way. That's kind of how I read that ending. Is like, I'm mad, but I'm mad at Paul, but I'm also mad at myself. You know, like, of course, I some part of me knew this was going to happen.
Yeah,
and who knows where she? I mean, she's the biggest mystery for me in part 3, because she doesn't seem to be going on exactly the same journey she's going to take in the.
In the books, no, because in the books she definitely like sticks with Paul.
Yeah, and that's the thing where it's like I said, that's where you get a lot of the what reads as very misogynistic stuff, where they're just like, no way, man, Chani stands by Paul all the way, baby.
Well, and there's way more in the books about the whole like feudal concubine kind of relationship that existed between Duke Leto and Jessica, also like happening with Paul and Chani, where it's like, okay, this is the person I'm with romantically but not married to legally. Which I'm glad they don't use the word concubine all that much in these movies.
It's kind of like addressed in part 1, but it doesn't feel as like ugh.
No, I think Leto has like one line where it's like, I should have married you.
Yeah. So anyway,
but speculating for the eventual part 3.
Yeah.
Spoilers for books that came out 50 years ago.
I mean, no question, broad thematics, right?
Yeah.
Has to be a what have I wrought, right, for Paul?
Yep. And that's a big part of Dune Messiah is like people who survive his holy war across the galaxy coming back and being like, was it worth it? Did Muad'Dib lead us to a promised land? And some of the Fremen characters reacting to that, the rest of the galaxy reacting to that. That's when you get a lot of the weird like guild stuff is in Dune Messiah. You have like these characters called face dancers, which are like shape-shifting assassins show up, which is a lot of fun.
I think an interesting thing that we'll see about part 3, I think, once again, if you're just looking at the subject matter and thematics of both Messiah and Children of Dune to a certain extent, is something we don't see in a lot of stuff, which is reckoning with the legacy of actions in movies. That's not something that big blockbuster franchises often do. It's something I wish Star Wars had done in the sequel trilogy more.
And not just like reset to baseline good versus evil. Yeah.
Right, because and this is something that happens in reality all the time. Oftentimes, seemingly justified rebellions end up being worse leadership than the regimes they overthrew.
Just read a little bit about the French Revolution.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like it's a thing that happens time and time again, where it's like somebody took over the best of intentions, but in some ways, it's easier to be the rebellion than to actually like, all right, you've got the throne now. What are you doing? It's like, shit, I don't know.
Just ask Joseph Stalin what happened.
Yeah,
there. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff to do in that is going to be somewhat new territory for like massive genre franchise filmmaking.
Yeah. If they keep with the story of the books, we might see a certain Momoa back in the picture.
Oh, well, I mean, that's just, come on. That's a like, Warner Brothers is going, you got to, baby. You got to get him in there. We got to put butts in seats, and we love our boy.
If they get into all the weird cloning stuff, that opens the door to like the rest of this franchise in ways that I don't know if storytellers beyond Villeneuve are prepared to handle well.
But I think that I am so on board for part 3. They're gonna have to convince me past that if they want to keep going, right? Because like the idea of he's gonna create a trilogy and he's like, I think that's it for me then. Which, fair enough. And you really want to make 8 Dune movies? Do we even want that? But yeah, I do think it's a thing where because they'll keep going. There's no question. There's too much money on the table. I mean, they're already trying to do it, right, with the show.
Well, I think there is a satisfying ending to be had with Children of Dune and maybe a little bit into God Emperor in terms of like, okay, there can be an end point here. Now, stuff can absolutely happen beyond that end point. It does in the books.
Yeah.
But like, if we want to have a satisfying ending to this story,
Right.
the bits that we get in Messiah and Children of Dune, I think there's a milieu there that you have to like create. I think you got to break down both of those stories, figure out what works, what doesn't, and
well, I think no matter what, as we were talking about, it'd be very tough to completely adapt either one of those, like to faithfully adapt either one. So I think no matter what, part 3 is gonna have even more of Villeneuve's stamp on it. It's gonna be even more his take on concluding this trilogy. I think no matter what, because it's just number one, Messiah isn't at all a film structured story. Like it's just not. It's not. It was written. It's purposefully an epilogue, right? It is meant to be
basically
an addition to. It's not a traditional sequel in that sense. And then Children of Dune kind of is I mean, it is the Children of Dune, right? It is about the how the next generation reacts, basically.
Yeah, that story is all about like Paul's children and his sister, and like how does a regime continue beyond its charismatic leader?
Right, and that's interesting stuff. But also, that's not really what anyone probably what movie audiences want out of a part 3. Suddenly, now it's about the kids of this, like
and who aren't introduced yet.
Right. So it's like I think it's going to be really interesting to see what he. You know that Lynch wrote a script for Dune Messiah, right?
Oh, no?
Yeah.
I'm sure that was wild.
I've always wanted to read it. I don't know if it's out there anywhere, but he did. Because they were all ready to go on more Dune movies until that came out. No one saw it.
Until it flopped.
Yeah. And I don't know what movie they thought was going to interest people there. But because, like I said, regardless of the Dune stuff, that movie is just like, oh, I'll make it real weird.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I would be curious to read that. But yeah, I think no matter what, it's gonna really feel the most like an original movie. I think because it's gonna have to bring all of this stuff together too. If he really is viewing this as a trilogy, I'm gonna be really curious to see it.
Right, and like giving us the satisfying Act 3 and trying to avoid some of the foibles of a successful adaptation like Return of the King. That one of the big complaints about that film is just like, okay, it could have ended 4 endings ago.
I'm one of those people who I 100% know exactly where that movie should. I mean, like I have a strong opinion.
You bow to no one, and
there's your ending.
Yeah,
that is such, and that is an example of. I think, and certainly it doesn't dampen. It's still a great movie. That's still an incredible trilogy, but it does speak to an allegiance to the source material that is actually like blinding him as a filmmaker. I think.
And yeah, look,
like I said,
I'm the guy who sits down and watches the extended editions regularly. So
I don't think it's bad. Like I said, I don't think it's bad, but it's definitely like Well, the extended editions though exist for a reason because they're more of that. He knew though to put in theaters, there needs to be the more movie structure to it or whatever. That's fine. Yeah,
I'll be curious to see where
you can't really
decide to wrap this up.
I guess what I'm saying there isn't an equivalent to Return of the King. Instead, you have these 2 books that sort of bring an end, kind of, except for now there's a billion more after it.
Well, and that's why the miniseries, the McAvoy one that Sci-Fi did as the follow-up to their Dune miniseries, was a combination of Messiah and Children.
Which actually I thought was really smart. Like I did think that was. I mean, I thought that worked. Anywho,
I hope it happens. I'm sure it will. At this point, this movie's made buckets of money. So
absolutely. All right, well that wraps up our discussion of that. Of course, if you want more from this show and everything on the Punch Up Entertainment Network, head over to our Patreon page. That's patreon.podbean.com/punchup. There'll be a link down in the description below. And make sure if you're watching us on YouTube to like, comment, subscribe. We always love to hear from you guys. Really does help the show.
There's a bit missing from the Dune movies that exist right now that like you wanted to see that weren't in there. Let us know in the comments below.
Absolutely. Next month on the show, Gorgoni, I think we're gonna bust some ghosts.
Does it make you feel good, John?
It just might. Yeah. Next month on the show, we'll be talking Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. I'm very excited for this movie. I mean, no surprise. I love but I got to say, this looks really great and looks unlike any other Ghostbusters movie I've seen.
The trailers cut scarier, right?
They cut
Is it just
scary.
me?
I think they're leaning. They're going back into horror, which always has been something I think pretty much almost every movie since the first movie has kind of forgotten about. The Ghostbusters.
Well, you have a couple of cartoon shows in the intervening years. It certainly helps water the
the aesthetic of it, building it around the ice and stuff like that. You're just immediately visually separating it, which I think is one of the biggest things that franchise has needed. That franchise always kind of reverts back, and which I think was necessary with the previous movie to sort of get the thing back on track. And now I think this one really feels like it's blazing a new trail. So
I'll be very curious to see where it goes.
I'm so excited for Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. We'll talk next week. But that's going to do it for this week's episode, or this month's episode as it is, of Panel Up. I'm John Campbell.
And I will always be Mike Gargoni.
Till next month, we're going to panel down.